presentation. It's great to be with you and present on this topic. It is a very important topic, and so it's great to have groups from the university who want to know more about it. So, look, my role is to speak briefly about just give you some basic facts and background on the phenomena of depression, and then Judy will have a more specific focus on the role of spiritual and religious beliefs with respect to depression. So, but let me just say, I'm happy if you've got a quick question, just pop your hand in the air, and it's a small enough group that I think we can be a bit conversational about it, so don't hesitate to ask a question or clarification. All right, so let me give you some background about the phenomena of depression. Now, you know, one of the things that people say about depression, they refer to it as the common cold of mental health problems. And there's a sense in which that's true, and there's a sense in which it's very untrue. So the sense in which it's true is that it is quite common. So throughout the lifespan, depending on which study you're reading, probably about 1 in 5 to maybe 1 in 4 people will experience a very serious clinical episode of depression throughout their life. So this is a period of time where they are very disabled by this depression. There's a risk of they can't function in their normal roles, and there may be, you know, a risk of suicide. So we're not talking about, and this is the sense in which the statement is untrue. A common cold is not thought of as a very severe form of illness, whereas depression can be quite severe and life-threatening. About 1 in 7 people who suffer from clinical depression will attempt suicide. Okay? So we're talking about something that's quite, and we know that it also has an effect on health across the lifespan. As medical people, you might be interested in the fact that there's a very strong association between depression and heart disease. And some people have estimated that depression is a equivalent risk for heart disease across the lifespan as smoking. So, you know, you can see that there's also a very strong psychosomatic connection here that's important to understand. So now, the next thing I want to briefly address is what do we mean when we say depression? And depression is one of those complex terms because it's used in common speech to refer to a whole range of different experiences, and then it has a clinical definition as well. And it makes it very complex, and it's very different to other diseases that we deal with in clinical work, where, you know, people don't often talk about, for example, diabetes it's sort of like as a sort of an everyday phenomenon. There's someone, I'm a bit diabetic because I just had some sugar, but that's different from being really diabetic, you know. But yet we do that with depression. We say, I'm feeling a bit depressed today, meaning I've got low mood, and that of course is a normal phenomenon that everybody experiences. Everyone has variations in mood, and everyone has times when they feel down and they feel low and they feel sad, and that's an important part of being human. However, there is also this clinical presentation of depression that is really quite different to that and has a certain threshold of severity. So, if you talk about depression in terms of feelings, that's one thing, but then when we look at the clinical definitions, they generally come from things like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the WHO ICD, and they will have certain criteria and, if you like, a threshold that it says now, if you've reached that, you've got clinical depression, and they will involve symptoms like feeling sad most of the day, more days than not, for at least 2 weeks, or not enjoying things. Anhedonia is the technical term for that, for that sort of period of time. Excessive guilt, problems with sleeping, problems with eating, overeating or losing your appetite, thoughts of suicide, inability to function, difficulties with decision making. There's a whole series of symptoms, and if a person meets a sufficient number of these symptoms, then we say that they've got clinical depression. Now, one of the important things about that from a clinical point of view is that it uses what's sometimes referred to as the Chinese menu approach, which is that you can reach criteria for clinical depression using many different combinations of specific symptoms. So one person who's meeting criteria for depression might look, in terms of their symptoms and their presentations, quite different from another person. So it's what we call a very heterogeneous disorder in terms of its presentation, in terms of its clinical presentation. Now, one question that we wrestle with a lot in the study of depression is, where should the criteria be? And the reason for this is that it is essentially arbitrary, right? There is no if you look at people in the community who are experiencing a little bit of depression, a bit more depression, a lot of depression, a great deal of depression, there's no real clear cut point. And so why, then, you may ask, do things like the DSM and the ICD then make a cut point? Why do they say, here you have clinical depression, and if you're below that you don't, and if you're above you do? Well, obviously it's an inexact science, but what it's trying to estimate is it's trying to estimate the level of severity at which, all things considered, it would be good for you to get some help. So that's the sense in which we mean clinical. We don't mean it in terms of that there is now a different or unique pathological process occurring that's completely different from what's happening for someone who doesn't meet that criteria. What we're saying is that all things considered, on balance, we think if you're more severe than this, probably it's a good time to get some help. And that help could take a number of forms. All right, so let me talk now a little bit about some of the causes of depression. Now, one of the things that depression is such a challenging but fascinating issue is because it really involves every aspect of the human person. It involves their biology, their psychology, their environment, their interpersonal relationships. And we can see that there are causal factors clearly related to depression in all of these areas. So, for example, we know that genes explain something about risk for depression, but not a lot. They're definitely there, they definitely play a role, they're definitely only a minor contributor. We know that the environment plays a strong role. So, for example, experiences of maltreatment and stress as a child make people much more likely to experience depression. If you're looking at depression amongst teenagers, I wonder if any of you can guess there is a particular life event that is the strongest predictor of depression. Anyone guess what it is?
Maybe a parent's death?
That certainly is a predictor, but that's not the strongest one. Yep?
Divorce?
Well, for teenagers, you're sort of right, you're sort of wrong. Most teenagers aren't getting divorced because they're not married, but it's the breakdown of a girlfriend-boyfriend relationship.
Oh, they're like their parents.
Oh, their parents divorced. Okay, well in that case, that certainly is related, but once again, that's not the biggest predictor. Statistically, the biggest predictor, and I'm not talking about just feeling down, I'm talking about the biggest predictor of the onset of clinical depression, someone really feeling that their life is hopeless, that they can't go on, etc., is the breakdown of a close relationship. Right? And of course, this is something that most people go through during adolescence, often for the first time. Heartbreak.
Were you meaning specifically like a
romantic relationship?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, certainly being rejected from peers and friends is also another very powerful driver of depression, and we see that, of course, in all contexts. But nowadays, it's very much related to cyberbullying and things like that. You know, very common phenomenon with teenagers. But the most powerful predictor is this breakdown of a close romantic relationship. So what I'm saying is that the environment matters, stress matters. That, you know, this is a powerful predictor, and it seems to work hand in glove with the genetic vulnerability as well. But we also know that there are various biological systems, and I could talk about this for hours, but we'll just briefly go over two. So we know that there are neurochemical abnormalities to do with neurotransmission that are abnormal in depression, and of course this is what is targeted by most of the antidepressant medications. So the antidepressant medications generally, in some way or another, alter the behaviour of monoamine neurotransmitters like serotonin, noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and dopamine and things like this. They are very blunt instruments. They affect all sorts of neurochemical systems in the body because not every serotonergic system has to do with mood. And this is why you get side effects with those medications, because of course it's affecting the whole system. They're not targeted just to the brain regions that are involved in mood. But nevertheless, there are neurochemical abnormalities. There are abnormalities in terms of the functioning of the stress system, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis system, which produces cortisol and results in the stress response. And we know that amongst people who are experiencing depression, that system is in overdrive. For example, one thing that happens is that the level of cortisol drops off in the evening normally. People experiencing depression stays high. So there's things like that that are going on. There are differences in the way the brain looks, the way the structure of the brain, the size of different parts of the brain, particularly regions like the hippocampi. So there's a whole lot of biological involvements too. We also know that depression is very much, the thinking and the way you interpret the world, the way you think about your life and your emotions and your interpersonal relationships is a big thing in depression. So, for example, a famous quote in depression is people talk about the cognitive triad of depression, which is a negative view of the self, the world, and the future. So I'm a bad person, the world is a horrible place, and the future is bleak. And if you talk to someone who's feeling depressed and who's dealing with significant depression, you will see those themes often come through in their speech. They'll say, I'm a failure, nobody likes me, I can't do anything right, I just can't get up in the morning, there doesn't seem to be any point to doing anything. I mean, what's the point of doing things like that? And when you know, how do you feel about the future? Oh, you know, nothing's going to change. It's always going to be like this. Right? So these are the kind of cognitions that we see in people who are suffering from depression. And of course you can see the vicious cycle that those kinds of thoughts would set up with the mood of depression. You feel low mood, you start to think that way. The more you think that way, the more it drives your mood down. And so there's a vicious cycle that gets set up there. And so some of the treatments that we use in psychological therapies, like cognitive behaviour therapy, really are targeted expressly at trying to break those vicious cycles. The vicious cycle of negative thinking and the vicious cycle of withdrawing behaviour. So that's the other big one. People who are depressed don't do much. They want to withdraw. They withdraw from their friendships. They withdraw from their hobbies, from their activities. They sometimes withdraw from doing anything at all. And the irony of depression is that you feel like doing nothing, but doing nothing makes you worse. Right? So another component of psychological treatment is to activate people, and you have to get over a hump there because they feel so low in motivation and like it's hard to get going. But in fact, the irony is that if they can get over that hump, then they'll actually feel better being more active. It's not like, you know, with a lot of medical conditions we say, listen, you're feeling ill, lie down, rest, take it easy for a while. Depression tends to be the opposite of that. Being more active will actually lift your mood. Being less active will actually be mood suppressive. Now, I'll just say, how am I going for time? I've got to finish in a minute. So I'll just say a couple of things about depression during adolescence. This is a very important topic for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you look at the rates of depression across the lifespan, you find that they're actually fairly low until you get to right around the age of puberty, and then they pick up dramatically. And so for most people who have problems with depression during their life, not everyone, but most of them, they will first experience that problem during adolescence. Now, we've got a lot of theories about why that is. Some people think it has to do with puberty and the pubertal hormones that are changing physiology during that time of life. Some people think it has to do with the changes in relationships that occur. So the different kinds of relationships that are coming online, particularly, obviously, we talked about before about boyfriend-girlfriend or close romantic relationships start to become a feature. But also the whole social world gets more complex at that phase of life. If you watch any kind of teen movie, what is it about? It's about rejection, who's in, who's out, who belongs, who's up, who's down, who's in the cool group, who's in the daggy group, like so. And that kind of social hierarchy and awareness that, you know, where I belong in this hierarchy. Am I one of the cool kids, one of the slightly cool kids, one of the completely uncool kids? You know, that kids become aware of that around the age of 12, 13. That's when it starts to kick in. So we think that change in social cognition, about the way you negotiate the social world, actually is part of what is involved in this greater risk for depression. But whatever the specific reasons are, you know, there is a dramatic increase, and it's a key time of life for both intervention and prevention. Because obviously one of the things that's happening during adolescence is that people are building up what you might call social capital. That is that they are getting an education, they are forming friendships, often which are lifelong friendships, the most important social resources to you across your lifespan. And we know that kids who experience depression when they get to the end of adolescence, obviously they have achieved less well academically, they have smaller social networks, they have less, and amongst girls, they're more likely to experience teen pregnancy. Interestingly, kids who have experienced depression are more likely to get married earlier, and they're also more likely to get divorced earlier. So there's a whole set, and broadly across the community, they're more likely to have been engaged with the forensic system and so forth and so on. So there's a whole sense in which people who go through depression during their teenage years are, now this is not true of every single example obviously, but statistically they're less likely to arrive at the end of adolescence with a good, what we call social capital, with good education, good vocational prospects, good social networks and supportive relationships, rich hobbies, and the other things that we know are really important and supportive in terms of people's quality of life and mood and ability to function. So for that reason, adolescence is a very particular, and I think there was a specific emphasis on adolescence today, so that's why I said that. Okay, so what have we talked about? Tried to define depression. This is like the 15-minute version, it's pretty rushed. Define it a little bit, we've talked a little bit about causes, we've talked a little bit about, I've touched a tiny bit on treatments. At this point, do you have any particular questions? Yeah?
How do you try and solve the problem? Yeah. If you
Of
know you have aggression, for example, what steps can you take to try and solve it for yourself? And if you don't have depression, but you know someone that does,
Yes.
what can you do for them?
Okay, so I'll be brief. There's two in a sense, they're two separate questions. What can you do for yourself and what can you do for someone else? Okay, what you can do for yourself depends a little bit on how severe the problem is. There are many very important self-help things that people can do. Okay? Just briefly, one of the things that you can do if you're feeling mildly depressed is to be more active. And I mean being more active both physically, so exercise, for example, is very good for depression, but also being more active socially. That is spending time, but choosing wisely the people you're spending time with, right? Choose relationships and friendships that are supportive, that are close, that are tolerant. Don't spend time with people who are critical and nasty, because that's probably going to be a downer to your mood and something that's really challenging to you at a time when you're feeling sensitive, as people do when they're feeling depressed, right? But generally we do know that being socially active and being physically active is good for mood. And so that is something that you can do. Now, however, that's just an example, but self-help will only get you so far, especially as things become more serious. And when things become more serious, then there is a point at which it's good to get outside help. And so that may take the form of counselling, and in more severe cases it may take the form of psychotherapy and medical intervention through a psychiatrist or a general practitioner or someone like that. So the options there might be, obviously antidepressant medication, and some of the what we call evidence-based psychological approaches, and they would include things like cognitive behaviour therapy, which is the approach that has the strongest evidence base for its effectiveness. But there are other approaches that have very good evidence base. There's one called interpersonal therapy, which really emphasises your behaviour in your relationships and how you can change that to manage your mood better. Now, and the other thing that's probably worth touching on once again, because this is, I know many of you are biomed students, in very severe forms of depression, it's one of those situations where electroconvulsive therapy is still treatment of choice. Now, we're talking about extremely severe cases where people may be in hospital, they'll show, it'll be a very dramatic presentation, they may be mute, unable to speak, extremely slowed down in their speech and their movement, so they have what we call psychomotor retardation. There's a very strong biological feel to it as a presentation, and in those cases, for some people, electroconvulsive therapy, which is passing a current through the brain, can be a dramatically effective treatment. It's a controversial treatment because there is still some questions about the degree to which it may result in some brain damage and memory loss. But I can tell you that when you've seen it work, it's one of the most dramatic treatments you'll see, not just in psychiatry, but in all of medicine. You can see people who are absolutely, like I say, in bed, mute, unable to function, unable to speak, and in the afternoon can seem quite normal. So it's one of those mysteries of life. Unfortunately, it's a little bit like kicking the television when it's broken. We don't know why it works. That's part of the problem. But we do know that it does in some cases. But that's actually true of many medical treatments. Actually, if you get down to it, there's a lot of medical treatments that are empirical. We know that they work, but we don't know exactly why. We don't know what the mechanism is. So it's not unique to that particular treatment. Anyway, but I should emphasise that's a subset, a very small subset of people with very severe depression. For most people, it will be looking at those self-help options, but also the psychotherapy and maybe medication for some people. Now, let me just briefly, because I've got to probably let Judy speak, but address the issue about when I give public talks, a very common thing that people come to me with is they say, look, there's someone in my family, there's a friend of mine, I really think they're depressed, they're suffering, they seem to be showing a lot of the symptoms you're talking about, but they won't admit it, or they won't seek help. And this is a very difficult situation for someone you care about and you love, and you see them suffering like this and they don't want to seek treatment. And there's no easy answer to that. The only answer that I can give is that you have to pick your moment, right? So pushing at the wrong time will often produce the opposite result. It will produce resistance. So you have to kind of be there for them and just wait for those little opportunities where you see the guard come down a little bit and they say, you know, I'm really struggling at the moment, I don't know what to do. And there's you've got your little opening and you can say, oh, well, have you thought about this? You know, then you can make your suggestion. Now this is like a 30-second burst on something that's very complicated and nuanced, but the simple take-home message is you've got to pick your moment. Simply going there with all guns blazing and saying, look, I think you're depressed and you really need to go and see someone and you need to do it now, will often produce the opposite result, which will be them saying, no, I don't want to do that, mind your own business, leave me alone, because there's a reason why they're not sure. There's a reason why they're defending against it at the moment, and you know, you will just push that button if you're not careful. So, all about the timing. Okay, now we'll have time for questions later on, but Judy, I'll hand over to Judy now, and she can talk about hers.
I'm going to give a rather different perspective on this to you. There are many of you will say, I know two people, they have almost identical life events, they seem to have the worst of everything, you know, they got chucked out of home, they're on the streets and all that. One of them is surviving really well, making good, getting themselves better. The other one is severely depressed. Why is that? Why is it that some people seem to manage to deal with the ups and downs of life much better than everybody else? And the partial answer is something we call in psychology resilience. Okay? Some people are just a bit more resilient than others to the sorts of things that get chucked at them. And resilience comes in various forms, and there are various things that subscribe to resilience, including your genetic makeup and the temperament you're born with and all those sorts of things, and to a degree the environment that you're in, although it is the case that similar environments can produce very different outcomes. So it's defined as the ability of an individual to function competently in the face of adversity or stress. Now you're all medical students, so there's a very good chance that you have a lot of knowledge of your own resilience, because medical study is one of those places which I'm sure has plenty of adversity and stress. So if you are resilient as an adolescent, as Nick put the other side of this, if you're depressed as an adolescent, you have some fairly negative life outcomes afterwards. If you're resilient as an adolescent, you have some pretty positive life outcomes, even if you end up experiencing some pretty bad things. So, now I'm going to cherry pick something here. This is by no means the only factor that contributes to resilience. However, it is the case that in many of the studies that, and I will do a bit of a meta-analysis of those studies, that religiosity or some sort of spirituality, now I'm not talking about only Christian belief, I'm talking about general religious belief, which for our culture may be Christianity, it may be Islam, maybe Hinduism or Judaism, but the bottom line is having some sort of religiosity or spirituality seems to confer resilience. And so this often, for adolescents, takes the form of some sort of belonging to a group, going to church, youth group and so on. And that has led a lot of sceptical people to say that's what it is, okay? The reason religiosity works is because you're in a group, you're surrounded by people, you've got activities, all those things that are very good for conferring resistance for depressive symptoms. However, it is the case that all major religions have something to do with one's relationship with a god, some higher power, a sense of the sacred, all of those things is part of every religion. And it does seem like it is a route to a more positive mental health outcome. And it is also the case that there is social support and caring relationships there. So that has led people to be sceptical about whether it's religiosity at all, and it's equally caused a number of people to do some experimentation on it. Let's see whether or not there's something more than just belonging to a group. So this is and I will make these PowerPoint slides available to Alison afterwards, because all these references are at the end of the PowerPoint slides. So if you're interested, you'll be able to have a look at it. But this is a US study of 12th graders in 2002, and they identified them as either more religious, as measured by the importance of religion in their lives or their attendance at church or religious services, and they seemed to have higher self-esteem and were more positive in their attitudes than their peers who were less religious. And then when they were followed into early adulthood, those who reported still attending church or some other religious group, and how important religion were significantly less likely to be depressed or to feel that life is meaningless and to have a stronger sense of purpose. So those are associations at the moment. We can't do too much in terms of it being causal, but there's certainly an association there between those people who were attending church, did have, felt that religion was important in their lives. And then this other study actually just was about attendance at church. So there is quite a bit of evidence that suggests that religion, religious belief, can contribute to your sense of well-being. And I've put there a whole lot of references that show that there's some kind of positive association. However, there is a huge problem in studying this, and that is that researchers are not decided on what the measures are going to be. How are we going to measure religiosity? And because, as a result of this, a number of people were being rather sceptical about the whole thing, they decided, some researchers decided that they would do a meta-analysis of all the research that had happened across all the studies on religion. And that's this lot. Ru and Wong in 2006. So they reviewed all the research. And so they looked at 43 studies that were up to 2003. They looked at them under a number of categories, whether or not they were based on conceptual or theoretical frameworks, what sort of types of religiosity and spiritual measures were used and their effects. They wanted to evaluate the quality of these measures, whether they had validity. I'm sure you've heard about validity and reliability in research. How, are they actually measuring the construct that they say they're measuring? They wanted to determine categories and frequencies of measures of health attitudes and behaviours, because again, not only are the religious measures not well defined, neither are the health outcomes well defined. So they wanted to look at all those things. And also whether there was an effect of religiosity on adolescent health attitudes and behaviours. So this is what ended up. Over half were based on a wide variety of conceptual and theoretical models. 37 distinct religiosity or spirituality variables were identified, so that's a lot of variables, and they in turn varied in specificity. But all 43 studies included measures of health risk behaviours and attitudes, and 84% showed that the measures, whatever their measure were, so we've got a huge variety of measures, but whatever the measure is, 84 of them suggested there were positive effects on health and behaviour. So from this, the authors concluded then that it looks like there is an important correlation between adolescent health and behaviours with some sort of spiritual belief. Now, we've talked about brains and differences in brains in adolescents, and I thought this was a rather nice study which has just come out, where they actually measured the brains of people who had a religious belief and compared them with those that didn't. And they had two groups, those that had been identified as having a high risk for depression. Now, we talked about the criteria, so there are a number of things that add to your risk of depression, like, you know, you're not living with your parents, say, because they're divorced and you don't have a home to go to, all of those things. You add up all of those things and you get some measure of risk of depression, so they took that. And then they did a 5-year study of those people. And to be honest, I was quite surprised about this finding, but it is in a reputable psychiatry journal, so I'm assuming it must be right. So the thickness of their brain was measured on the second occasion, and they showed that the brain cortices of the individuals who placed high importance on religion were thicker than those that did not, which might be part of this resilience thing. It might be that's actually helping with the resilience. But more importantly, it especially occurred on people who had a high risk of depression. So there was a particular effect. Now this was an important finding because it actually specified the relationship between religiosity and depression as a particular illness. So, well, you know, what do we say about all of this? How do we, you know, what can we take from this? Well, it is still the case that there are large numbers of people who believe that all it is you're in a community. Okay, you go to church and you have people around you, and most churches don't let you just sit there and leave. Most churches have some kind of a community active group who will, if they see someone on their own, they'll go and engage with them and so on. And so there are still people who believe that. But the research is not supporting that. The research is saying, even if you take all these other community things into consideration, you take people who belong to clubs and other social groups and compare them with those that belong to churches, you still get this additional effect. So I have a completely untested suggestion I'm going to make, and maybe one of you will go along and have a go at researching it. This is my suggestion. My suggestion is that obviously the social thing is going to have some positive effect. I don't think we can discount that. But it's not only that. And the reason it's not only that is depression is often defined, and Nick, without us having compared notes, defined it this way, to do with loneliness, isolation, withdrawal, being just yourself and feeling the world's all against you and so on. Okay, what does define people who have spiritual belief is they are actually never alone. You always have someone or thing that you feel is there. And it doesn't, you don't have to be a Christian, but I'll talk only from the Christian belief perspective. If you are a Christian, you have a very strong feeling of the presence of God around you. Okay? As you're moving around, you sort of feel that is part of you moving around with you. And so and I would love someone to test this out, whether or not, in fact, it is, and so it would need an experiment where you actually ask people specifically, do you feel that, do you just attend church? There are lots of people who say they're Christians and religion is very important. That means they go to church on a Sunday and they forget about it for the rest of the week. Then there are other people for whom Christianity or religion is very important in their whole lives. It defines their lives. So what we would need is to look at those groups, because both groups are experiencing church in one form or another, but one group specifically feels that they are never alone. And my suggestion about the connection that we're finding in all of this research is that it is that despite you being physically alone, you never feel totally alone. But, as I say, this is a completely untested, and one as an academic should never make such comments. But okay, so now I think it's an open forum, is that right?
Yes.
So shall I get rid of my controversial slide?
Happy to run this part yourselves.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
All right, well, any questions or comments? We can have discussion. Yes.
Hi, I'm from the arts, so I have no medical or scientific background. Yeah, so I was quite interested in the point that the thickening of the cortices for those who are both emphasize religion and have a high risk of depression. What does that mean?
Oh, a high familial risk of depression means that genetically you may be more predisposed to depression because your parents were depressed, or you've got a sibling who committed suicide, or so it's people who, there's a questionnaire, that research had a questionnaire about depression and from a similar sort of thing to the DSM criteria set, you know, do you do this, you know, all of those questions that get asked there. And people then got categorised as at high risk. So they weren't depressed at the moment, but they were at high risk because of their life experiences and their genetics.
So what does the thickening of the cortices?
Cortices, well, okay, I mean, my very limited, and Nick may need to help on this, the frontal lobes are very important on decision making and processing and so on, and I'm quite sure the frontal lobes are well active in depression because they are making interpretations about events and so on. So a thickening of it is an increase in the numbers of neurons, and the assumption is that it's going to sort of stand you in better stead if you've got more processing equipment to try and address some of these problems. Something like that?
Yeah, I mean, so the way people talk about brain, so cortical thickness means, so you may know that there's the grey matter, which is on the outside of the brain, and then there's the white matter, which is the internal part of the brain. So cortical thickness has to do with the thickness of that grey matter that's on the outside of the brain. And sometimes people talk about it in this sense. They say the little phrase is, what fires together, wires together. And what that means in neuroscience is it means that if an area is active, if it's used a lot, then it will tend, all things being equal, to have larger volume. Because it's a little bit, this is a bad metaphor, but the metaphor is of a muscle, right? That a muscle that you use will become larger. And so there's definitely limitations to that analogy, but that's probably not a bad, very broad way of thinking about it. I mean, one of the interesting things about the cortical thickness data is another group where there's been actually now extensive studies. It's been a bit of a fad in neuroscience is to study meditation and the effects of meditation on the brain. And there's a number of studies where they've done studies with Buddhist monks who've done, I don't know how many hours, 950,000 hours of meditation over their life, and they've looked at their brain, and then they've looked at the brains of novice meditators or non-meditators, and generally they tend to find this similar kind of effect, that is the thicker prefrontal cortices. So now, one of the big questions in research like this is the chicken and egg question. We don't really know for sure whether these people were always like this, and there's something about having this kind of brain that makes you more, predisposes you to maybe religious belief or being interested in meditation or having the self-discipline to, develop a very kind of disciplined meditation practice, or if this is actually an effect of this kind of activity, and they are harder questions to ask, because of course to answer those questions you really need to look at people very early on, before they've engaged in whatever it is you think might be responsible for it, meditation, prayer, religious belief, blah, 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 and then follow them over time and see if that changes developmentally, and that's a very tough question. But nevertheless, it's interesting to note that there has been this very extensive work done on meditation now. It's big literature, actually, and like I say, it's been probably fairly described as a bit of a fad, and there was a 1 year at the Society for Neuroscience meeting, which is the biggest meeting of neuroscientists in the world, There's about 30,000 people out there. They had the Dalai Lama speak. And that shows you the kind of cross-section between there, although there was a bit of controversy about that too, so people were not so pleased about the Dalai Lama speaking to me. But anyway.
Yes, I think it's very important that everything I presented was correlational data.
Yeah.
So two things were correlated with each other, and we don't know where the cause and effect is, just simply that those two things seem to come together.
I'm just really interested in how paranoia starts fitting in, because it feels like the people, this is sort of my trigger, because people start sort of reading into things that aren't there. Is that one of the symptoms? It hasn't actually been mentioned in terms of depression, but that paranoid sort of feeling,
Yes.
people are against you.
So, okay, so it depends, this is a good question, and it depends on what sense you're using the term paranoia, okay? So, normally in clinical psychology and psychiatry, when we use the term paranoia, we're talking about, usually about a delusional state, where that's the most common use of that term, where someone's experiencing psychosis or something like that, and they have paranoid delusions, and so they may have beliefs that are bizarre, and they believe that someone's poisoning their water, or the FBI's watching them with cameras, or something like that. Well, there's an old. Do you remember that poster from the 70s? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. But this is something you see quite often in schizophrenia. So you have various paranoid delusions, and often they're about conspiracies and things like that. And of course, they're extremely distressing to the people who hold them. They get very anxious about them, and up to and including people can attempt suicide because of these paranoid beliefs. Now, I think, however, you're talking more about something that we might call a particular style of cognitive interpretation, or like an over-interpretation. So, for example, let's take a very common everyday event. Let's say you're walking away and you see someone you know, and you walk and you sort of go to greet them. You walk past them, they walk past you, and they don't acknowledge you. Right? So then, at that point, the brain will start to make an interpretation. Now, for many people, they say, "Oh, you mustn't have seen me." But very commonly, for someone who's experiencing depression, they will tend to come to a more what you might be calling paranoid conclusion. "Oh, I've done something wrong. That person doesn't like me anymore. What did I do to offend them? Oh my goodness, the last time we spoke, I said that thing. I told that joke, it was a bit off colour, maybe they held it against me." So you start to search and think. And this is what we call rumination. And this is a process that's very closely associated with depression, where you think over and over and over about things, looking for explanations. And of course, what you do is you come to a conclusion that is part of that cognitive triad. I'm not a good person, the world's not a good place, or there's something wrong with it. Oh, I can never talk to that person again, obviously they don't like me. And of course, 99 times out of 100, the reality is they didn't see you. Right? But nevertheless, people tend to jump to that conclusion. So that's an example of the kind of cognitive processing, which maybe you could call paranoid, but it's in a more everyday kind of way. But that kind of interpersonal sensitivity is very closely associated with depression. People are very interpersonally sensitive. They tend to over-interpret things. They tend to think about them a lot, and they tend to jump to the most negative possible conclusion. And of course, once again, we were talking before about vicious cycles. That's something that can drive a vicious cycle. Because you jump to that negative conclusion, that makes you feel worse, which makes you then more likely to interpret things negatively, which then makes you feel worse, which makes you, and you
more
dig yourself down.
isolated, it means that they interpret everything wrongly, and you end up being interpreted wrongly as well.
Well, exactly, and so this is why in close relationships like marriages and so forth, if one partner is suffering from depression, it's a big burden on them, obviously, but also on their partner, because the partner often feels they can't do anything right. Because they're always making mistakes. This person's always taking it the wrong way. They always think I'm angry with them, even when I'm not. They're always jumping to conclusions. They're always feeling, accusing me of having an affair or whatever it might be. But there's always that kind of like negative interpretation that's placed on the thing. So as I said before, one of the well-known psychotherapies, cognitive behavioural therapy, actually tries to address that thinking very directly. And part of the technique is to help people to learn, first of all, to recognise when that thinking's happening, and then to also consider alternatives. So, and to actually learn that is a kind of like a rote process, because obviously what they've got is they've got a mental habit that's a very easy thing for them to do. The person walks past and they go, "Oh, that person doesn't like me." That's like, they don't sit there and think of it, like it's just like that. It's like a natural thing. And then to unlearn that natural reaction takes some effort and some looking at it, and that's what you can do in therapy.
One of the things that I use when I have a clinical psychology background and I have a practice and I specialise in adolescence, and one of the things that I'm constantly doing is saying, what are the options? You know, let's list all the alternatives, because often you get focused into this one alternative that drives you into that circle. And so it's really important to pursue all. So they say, you know, I'm going to fail my VC. Others, you know, or perhaps a biomed student saying, I'm not going to get into medicine, so there's no point, right? Because I know that that is an issue. But there are many other options around that you can pursue, but you need to have it drawn to your attention. You need to start turning a spotlight onto the other alternatives than the one that's causing them to down.
Girls are really good at overanalyzing everything. So, is there...
You say girls are really good?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Okay. Glad you said that.
So, does gender play a role in...
Yes, it's a really great question, and in fact you're exactly right. So, females are twice as likely to experience depression as males, as a case level, you know, like serious clinical depression. So there's clearly a gender aspect to depression, and interestingly, that emerges during adolescence. So if you look at younger kids, there's no gender difference. Something happens during adolescence that means the girls are much more likely to experience depression. Now, I should point out, the boys are not a picture of mental health, they just have different kinds of problems. So the biggest one we would know about is substance use, right? Substance use is much more common amongst males than females. Depression, much more common amongst females than males. So there's swings and roundabouts. One of the big theories of why females are more vulnerable to depression is because of the role of rumination. So you kind of putting your finger on it by saying girls overanalyze things, right? Females tend, on average, and of course anytime you're talking about females and males, I feel like I need to point out we're talking about here mean, on average. We're not talking about every given individual. It's like saying males are taller than females. That's true. But it doesn't mean that every male is taller than every female. So it's the same with this stuff. So we're not saying that every female does this more than every male, right? But you need to get the statistical inference right. But the point is that females, on average, tend to ruminate more. They tend to overthink things. They tend to think they're more interested in personal relationships. They tend to think about them more. They tend to spend more time wondering what's going on in personal relationships, and therefore sometimes tend to draw those negative conclusions and think people don't like me, and so forth. And that can be part of the vulnerability to depression. So there's a very well-known theory which says that that's the reason for the gender difference, is that girls ruminate more. They think more about relationships and the meaning of life, and boys, on average, are more into doing than thinking. Yeah.
I'm interested just to think about like the way that we conceptualise depression. So, like, if I knew that a friend had diabetes, like, I don't expect them to get better. But when I hear that somebody has depression, like, I think that we sometimes think about it having a certain lifetime, like
yes,
a life.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering about when somebody is experiencing depression longer term.
Yes.
Like, what is a framework for thinking about that? And for me personally, I'm a Christian, and so even thinking about a Christian friend who might be experiencing long-term depression that doesn't seem to be nearing an end,
yes.
Just a conceptual framework for how I should think about depression.
I think that's a fantastic question, and I'll tell you why. It's because people tend to think about depression as an episodic condition. That is, you have a depressive episode and then you get better, right?
Like the cold analogy.
Yeah, exactly. But in fact, if we look at the data, it shows us that people who suffer from depression, most people who experience depression will have multiple episodes across their lifespan, and the average is around about 6 serious episodes of depression for people who are vulnerable. So in other words, there's been a shift in our thinking to thinking about depression more as a kind of a chronic disorder. It does have episodes that kind of come and go, but the vulnerability remains. And so, and this is where the analogy with diabetes isn't a bad one, because this is, and I talk to patients about this, I say, look, you know, we know now that you've had 2 or 3 reasonably serious episodes of depression, so we know this is an issue for you, right? Now, you're feeling better now, which is fantastic, but that doesn't mean that the vulnerability has gone away. This is something you need to learn about yourself. It's a little bit like you know, needing to adjust your diabetic control in terms of, you know, how you ingest sugar or whatever it might be. This is something, if you manage it well, it could be a very small issue in your life. If you don't manage it well, it could become a very big issue. And so the question is, you might need to think very carefully about, how am I managing my stress? What kind of situations am I putting myself in? What kind of relationships am I having with other people? Are they supportive, productive relationships? Am I in a job where I feel, you know, put down or humiliated or something like that? I may be less able than other people to tolerate that kind of situation. It may be more important for me than other people to make that decision and go, you know, this isn't a good environment for me, perhaps I better move. I might have to learn to use psychological and medical services wisely, so that when I feel my mood's dropping a bit, before I find myself really in the ditch, I might have to learn to go off and seek help. I might have to know when's a good time for me to go back on my medication. You know, these are all things that I can do that are prophylactic, that prevent me from getting into the depths of depression. So thinking about it and talking to patients about it as a kind of a tendency that some people have, and there's nothing like right or wrong about that. We're all different. We all have different tendencies, you know, and you might, as a result of family history or previous experience or whatever, have a tendency to get depressed, right? Well, that's fine. That's part of life's written pageant. The question is now, what are you going to do about it? And how well are you going to manage that? And if you're wise about it, it could actually be a very small issue in your life. But if you ignore it and push yourself to the limit and leave yourself in these bad situations, then it could become a very big deal.
So that almost sounds a little bit like, you know, somebody saying, I'm an alcoholic and I've been sober for 15 years.
It's a little bit like that,
Okay.
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it's not, that analogy too will have its limits, but it's not bad. I mean, that's the idea of the AA and so forth, is to recognise, I will probably always have this tendency. You know, it's not going to magically go away. What I do have control over is how I manage that across my life, and that can be, in the case of someone who has a history of alcoholism, you know, they try to think, what can I do? Well, you know, I don't hang around with people who drink a lot. You know, that's not good for me. Other people may be able to get away with that. That's not going to be good for me. I have to use my sponsor, you know, and reach out to them at certain times when I'm feeling tempted to drink. You know, so it's about using the resources and making wise choices. And I think with depression, it can be very much the same thing.
Yes, is that, you're going to ask?
Yeah, we're almost at the end of our time, but I really wanted to ask you before we finish, what paths or support agencies are available to people who are feeling that they're needing some help with depression?
And I was just going to say that before people escape, we do need to just say this. On campus, there is a counselling service, which is in the Baldwin building, I think it is, and our placements from psychology, they are working their placements there, so that's one place where you can get help fairly easily. If you go onto the Psychological Sciences website of the university website, our clinic is listed there, and that is the actual clinic, which is in, I've forgotten the name of the street.
Blackwood Street.
Blackwood Street.
Just
It's
across
on
in North
Flemington
Melbourne.
Road.
Just across from the Royal Melbourne.
Yeah. And that has a full counselling service, psychological counselling service there. And then there are the standard things like Beyond Blue, and you know, if you type depression agencies or help into a Google search engine, you will get all those standard ones, Lifeline and Beyond Blue and so on. But for you personally, on campus, there are some very good services available for you, and it's a very easy process of getting access to them. So make the most of them, and if you've got people around you who you find the right moment, just say we'll go for a cup of coffee. And did you know that there's a counselling service in there?
The other thing that I'd add is that some people, those options work really well. For some people, they'd rather not seek help in an on-campus environment. They might be concerned they might see people that they know and so forth. So the other major option you have is always to go to your general practitioner. Now, you know, with the new, what they call Better Access, it's not that new anymore actually, but there's the Better Access to Mental Health scheme, which is the scheme that funds psychological therapies through the Medicare system. Most general practitioners will have a network of psychologists that they can refer to and that they know well and they trust. And so if you go to your general practitioner, they will not do the psychological counselling and so forth themselves, but they will be able to refer you to a trusted psychologist who they feel their work, you know, esteem their work, and that won't be too expensive, because there will be, and some even bulk bill. So that's another option for people if they don't want to do it in an on-campus way. But the services Judy's referred to are really good, so they're another good option.
Thank you.